There is a ship somewhere in the world right now, carrying passengers who believe they are safe, captained by someone who believes they are competent, owned by a company that has passed all inspections and received all certifications, and that ship is going to sink. Not because of a storm that no one could predict, not because of an act of war or terrorism that no security could prevent, but because of flaws that exist right now, flaws that someone probably knows about, flaws that will seem obvious and preventable after hundreds of people are dead, but that seem acceptable or manageable or unlikely to cause problems right up until the moment they cause catastrophic problems. This is not speculation or pessimism, but pattern recognition, based on more than a century of maritime disasters that follow the same script with such consistency that the script itself becomes a kind of curse, a doom that ships carry from the moment their keels are laid. April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic sinks in the North Atlantic after hitting an iceberg on its maiden voyage, killing more than 1,500 people in what remains the most famous maritime disaster in history. The ship was marketed as practically unsinkable, designed with the latest safety features, commanded by one of the most experienced captains in the White Star Line, and it sank in less than 3 hours because watertight compartments that were supposed to make it unsinkable only extended partway up the hull, and because there were lifeboats for only half the passengers, and because the captain maintained speed through an ice field despite multiple warnings. January 13, 2012, exactly 100 years later, the Costa Concordia runs aground off the coast of Italy, capsizes, and kills 32 people because the captain decided to sail close to shore to impress someone, and because when the ship hit rocks, the captain delayed evacuation and then abandoned ship before all passengers were off. 100 years separate these disasters, 100 years of technological advancement and improved safety regulations and better training and all the lessons that were supposed to have been learned from Titanic. And yet, the pattern repeats. Between 1912 and 2014, 7 major passenger ships sank during peacetime in accidents that were not caused by extreme weather or mechanical failure beyond human control, but by the same cluster of factors that appear with such regularity that they constitute a predictable pattern rather than a series of unrelated tragedies. The Lusitania in 1915, torpedoed by a German submarine, but carrying munitions in violation of its civilian status and sailing without escort through known dangerous waters. The Andrea Doria in 1956 colliding with another ship in fog despite both vessels having radar, sinking because design flaws made it top-heavy and unstable. The Herald of Free Enterprise in 1987 leaving port with bow doors open and capsizing in 90 seconds because the ro-ro ferry design allowed catastrophic flooding. The Estonia in 1994 losing its bow visor in a storm and flooding through the compromised bow because maintenance had been deferred and design flaws had been ignored. The MV Sewol in 2014 capsizing because it was overloaded and top-heavy while passengers obeyed orders to stay in their cabins and drowned as the ship rolled over. The pattern that connects these 7 ships is not coincidence or bad luck, but a consistent failure mode that emerges when economic pressure intersects with engineering complexity and human overconfidence. Every doomed ship begins with a design that incorporates fatal flaws, flaws that are often known to the engineers who design the ship or discovered during construction or revealed through near misses and close calls, but that are accepted rather than corrected because correction would be expensive or time-consuming or would require admitting that the design is flawed. The Titanic's watertight compartments that did not extend to the top of the ship, making them useless if more than 4 compartments flooded. The Andrea Doria's top-heavy design that made it unstable if damaged. The Herald of Free Enterprise's ro-ro design that allowed water to flood the entire vehicle deck instantly if the bow doors were open. The Estonia's bow visor attachment system that was known to have structural weaknesses. The Sewol's modifications that added extra decks and made it dangerously top-heavy. In every case, the flaw existed before the ship ever sailed, and in most cases, someone knew about it and either dismissed it as unlikely to cause problems or calculated that the risk was acceptable compared to the cost of fixing it. Every doomed ship operates under economic pressure that prioritizes speed or capacity or luxury over safety, creating incentives to cut corners or defer maintenance or rush procedures in ways that increase risk. The Titanic sailed on a tight schedule with pressure to arrive in New York on time and with insufficient lifeboat drills because drills would have disrupted passenger comfort. The Lusitania continued passenger service while carrying munitions because the revenue from passengers was too valuable to sacrifice, and because stopping service would have been admitting that the ship was a military target. The Herald of Free Enterprise operated on schedules so tight that crew members had to rush through procedures, and where requesting safety improvements like indicator lights for bow doors was rejected as too expensive. The Estonia was kept in service despite needing repairs because taking the ship out of service during high season would have cost the company revenue. The Sewol was overloaded far beyond legal limits because carrying maximum cargo maximized profit, and because the company calculated that the probability of getting caught or having an accident was lower than the guaranteed profit from overloading. In every case, economic logic pointed toward accepting risk, and in every case, the risk materialized. Every doomed ship is commanded or crewed by humans who make errors that seem inexplicable after the disaster, but that made sense or seemed reasonable at the time, and the errors are enabled by systems that lack redundancy or checks or cultures that discourage questioning authority or reporting problems. The Titanic's captain maintaining speed through ice fields because he wanted to arrive on schedule and because slowing down would have seemed overcautious. The Andrea Doria's officers misinterpreting radar and making wrong assumptions about the other ship's course. The Herald of Free Enterprise's assistant bosun falling asleep instead of closing the bow doors, and no one else checking because everyone assumed someone else had done it. The Costa Concordia's captain sailing close to rocks to show off and then denying the severity of the damage when the ship hit. The Sewol's captain abandoning ship while passengers remained inside following his orders to stay in their cabins. These were not inevitable errors, but predictable failures that occurred because the systems these people operated within allowed or encouraged bad decisions. Every doomed ship exists in a regulatory environment that is either inadequate or unenforced, where regulations lag behind ship design, or where inspections are cursory or corrupt, or where penalties for violations are too small to change behavior. The Titanic sailed legally with lifeboats for only half its passengers because regulations were based on ship tonnage rather than passenger capacity and had not been updated. The Herald of Free Enterprise operated legally without bow door indicators because regulations did not require them, even though the need was obvious. The Estonia passed inspections despite having cracks in the bow visor attachment because inspectors were not rigorous, and because the Classification Society did not enforce strict standards. The Sewol passed inspections despite being overloaded and top-heavy because inspectors were bribed or negligent, and because the regulatory agency had been captured by the industry it was supposed to regulate. In every case, the ship that sank was operating legally, had passed inspections, had received certifications, and was in compliance with regulations that were inadequate to prevent disaster. The curse of doomed ships is not supernatural but structural, not a matter of bad luck or isolated incompetence, but a predictable outcome of systems that prioritize short-term profit over long-term safety, that allow complexity to create vulnerabilities, that enable human errors through lack of redundancy, and that rely on regulations that are always fighting the last war rather than preventing the next one. The ships that sink are not outliers or exceptions, but the visible tip of a much larger problem, the failures that happen to be catastrophic enough to make headlines while thousands of near misses and close calls go unreported or uninvestigated or are classified as isolated incidents rather than as warnings of systemic problems. For every ship that sinks, there are dozens that almost sank, that experienced the same chain of failures, but where luck or last-minute intervention prevented catastrophe. And those near misses teach nothing, because humans are very good at explaining away close calls as proof that the system works rather than as warnings that the system is fragile. This documentary will examine 7 ships across 7 decades, from the Titanic in 1912 to the Sewol in 2014, and will demonstrate that they are not 7 separate tragedies, but 7 chapters in a single ongoing story about how humans build ships that cannot survive the conditions they will inevitably face. We will see that the curse repeats because the underlying incentives and structures that create doomed ships have not changed, that each generation believes it has learned from the previous generation's disasters while repeating the same patterns with different technology, and that somewhere right now another doomed ship is sailing toward its inevitable end, while passengers and crew and owners all believe that it cannot happen to them because they have modern technology or better training or stricter regulations. The same beliefs that every previous generation held right up until the moment their unsinkable ship sank. The pattern of doomed ships begins with the most famous maritime disaster in history. Not because the Titanic was the deadliest or the most preventable, but because it established the template that every subsequent disaster would follow, the combination of design hubris and economic pressure and human overconfidence that transforms a technological marvel into a death trap. The RMS Titanic was not cursed by fate or by supernatural forces, but by decisions made during its design and construction and operation, decisions that prioritized spectacle over safety and that created vulnerabilities so obvious in retrospect that they seem like deliberate sabotage, even though they were simply the predictable outcome of building the largest ship in the world as quickly and cheaply as possible, while marketing it as unsinkable. The ship that left Southampton on April 10, 1912, was already doomed, carrying within its steel hull the flaws that would kill more than 1,500 people 5 days later. And the remarkable thing is that many people knew about these flaws but convinced themselves that the flaws did not matter. The Titanic was born from competition, from the rivalry between White Star Line and Cunard that defined early 20th century transatlantic shipping. Cunard had built the Lusitania and Mauretania, ships that held the blue riband for fastest Atlantic crossing, and White Star Line could not compete on speed because their engines were not powerful enough, and because building faster ships would have been prohibitively expensive. So White Star chose a different strategy. They would build ships so large and so luxurious that speed would not matter. Ships that would be floating palaces where the wealthy would pay premium fares for unprecedented comfort, and where the journey itself would be the attraction rather than merely transportation between continents. The Olympic-class ships, Olympic and Titanic, and later Britannic, were designed to be 46,000 tons each, 50% larger than any existing ship, with amenities that included swimming pools and Turkish baths and grand staircases and dining rooms that rivaled the finest hotels on land. But building the largest ships in the world created engineering challenges that pushed beyond what experience could reliably predict, and the solutions to those challenges incorporated compromises that seemed reasonable during design, but that proved fatal in practice. The Titanic was divided into 16 watertight compartments, separated by bulkheads with doors that could be closed to contain flooding if the hull was breached, and the design was calculated to remain afloat even if the first 4 compartments were completely flooded, a level of damage that seemed impossible to exceed because it would require a breach extending more than 100 feet along the hull. This calculation was technically correct but fatally incomplete because the watertight bulkheads only extended up to E-deck, 15 feet above the waterline, rather than extending to the top of the ship, which meant that if more than 4 compartments flooded, water would spill over the top of the bulkheads and progressively flood each subsequent compartment like water spilling over ice cube dividers in a tilted tray. Thomas Andrews, the chief designer, understood this limitation and proposed extending the bulkheads higher, but the modification was rejected because it would have reduced space in first-class accommodations, and because the scenario of more than 4 compartments flooding simultaneously seemed so unlikely that designing against it seemed like excessive caution. The lifeboat situation was even more egregious because the ship was designed with davits capable of holding 64 lifeboats, enough to evacuate every passenger and crew member with room to spare, but only 20 lifeboats were actually installed because the Board of Trade regulations required lifeboats based on ship tonnage rather than passenger capacity, and because those regulations had not been updated since 1894, when ships were much smaller. The Titanic exceeded the legal requirement by carrying lifeboats for 178 people, when regulations only required capacity for 962, but the ship could carry 2,135 passengers and 900 crew, meaning that if fully loaded, more than half would have no lifeboat space. The White Star Line could have installed additional lifeboats voluntarily, but additional boats would have cluttered the first-class promenade decks that were part of the ship's luxury appeal, and the company calculated that passengers would prefer open deck space over lifeboats they would never need, because the ship was unsinkable. This calculation reveals the central hubris, the belief that engineering had advanced to the point where lifeboats were anachronistic safety equipment like medieval armor, technically still available, but unnecessary for modern vessels that could not sink. The steel used in the Titanic's hull was adequate for normal operating conditions, but became brittle at low temperatures, and the rivets that held the hull plates together were iron rather than steel in the bow sections because the shipyard lacked enough skilled riveters to use steel rivets throughout the ship, and because iron rivets were cheaper and faster to install. This cost-cutting measure concentrated the weakest materials in the area most likely to be struck during a collision, the bow, where the iceberg would eventually tear open the hull not through the sheer force of impact, but through the brittleness of the rivets which shattered rather than deformed. The metallurgical analysis that revealed these weaknesses was done decades after the disaster using recovered hull samples, but the shipyard in 1911 knew they were using lower quality materials in the bow and accepted this compromise because completing the ship on schedule was more important than using optimal materials throughout. The maiden voyage departed Southampton on April 10, 1912, with 2,224 people aboard. Far below capacity, but still a substantial passenger load that included some of the wealthiest people in the world traveling first class and hundreds of emigrants traveling third class, hoping to start new lives in America. Captain Edward Smith commanded the voyage, his last before retirement after a distinguished career with White Star Line, and the pressure to make the crossing impressive and fast must have weighed on him, even though the Titanic was not designed to compete on speed. The ship stopped briefly at Cherbourg and Queenstown to take on additional passengers and then headed into the North Atlantic along the southern route that was standard for April, but that brought ships dangerously close to the iceberg limit, where the southward-flowing Labrador Current carried ice from Greenland. On April 14th, the radio operators received at least 6 messages warning of ice in the ship's path, ice that extended much further south than was typical for April because the winter had been mild and the spring breakup had released more icebergs than usual. Captain Smith acknowledged the ice warnings but did not reduce speed, maintaining 22.5 knots as the ship proceeded into an area where icebergs had been reported by multiple vessels throughout the day. This decision has been debated endlessly, whether Smith was reckless or simply following standard practice for the era when captains maintained speed until ice was actually sighted, at which point they would slow or alter course. But the decision reveals the same overconfidence that permeated every aspect of the Titanic's design and operation. The belief that the ship was so large and so well built that it could handle any contingency, that even if an iceberg appeared, the ship could turn or stop in time, and that the watertight compartments made collision survivable even if the worst happened. The lookouts in the crow's nest did not have binoculars because the binoculars that had been issued to the lookouts during the ship's trials in Belfast were locked in a cabinet, and the officer who had the key had been reassigned before the maiden voyage and took the key with him. A bureaucratic failure so absurd that it seems like dark comedy, except that it contributed to the lookouts not seeing the iceberg until it was 500 yards away, leaving only 37 seconds before impact. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, the ship struck the iceberg on the starboard side, a glancing blow that lasted less than 10 seconds and that scraped along 300 feet of the hull, opening the hull plates in 6 of the forward compartments. The damage was below the waterline and not immediately visible, and many passengers felt only a slight shudder or heard a scraping sound but did not realize that anything serious had occurred. Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews inspected the damage and quickly understood that the ship was doomed, that 6 flooded compartments exceeded the 4-compartment survivability threshold, and that water would progressively flood over the bulkheads until the ship sank. Andrews calculated that the ship had perhaps an hour, maybe 2 if they were lucky, before sinking, and that calculation proved accurate. The ship remained afloat for 2 hours and 40 minutes, long enough to launch lifeboats, but not long enough to evacuate everyone, and not long enough for rescue ships to arrive. The evacuation was chaotic and inefficient, hampered by the fact that the crew had never conducted a full lifeboat drill, and that many crew members did not know which lifeboat stations they were assigned to, or how to operate the davits, or how to lower boats safely. The passengers were initially reluctant to board lifeboats because the ship seemed stable, and because the night was cold, and the lifeboats looked small and fragile compared to the massive liner, and many lifeboats left the ship half empty or less, because officers did not want to overload them and because passengers refused to board. The first lifeboat launched carried only 28 people, despite having capacity for 65, and multiple boats left with 20 or 30 people when they could have carried 60 or more, meaning that hundreds of people died waiting for lifeboat space, while earlier boats floated away half empty. The women and children first protocol was interpreted differently by different officers, some allowing men to board if no women were waiting, others refusing to allow any men, creating confusion and separating families and ensuring that the lifeboat distribution was both insufficient and poorly executed. The ship sank at 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, breaking in half as it went down, because the stress of the bow section pulling downward while the stern remained buoyant exceeded what the ship's structure could withstand. More than 1,500 people went into the water, and most died within 15 minutes from hypothermia because the water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that survival time was measured in minutes rather than hours. The Carpathia, the nearest ship that responded to the distress calls, arrived at 4 a.m. and rescued 710 survivors from the lifeboats, but there was nothing to be done for those in the water who had died hours earlier while the survivors in lifeboats heard their screams fading into silence. The disaster killed more than 1,500 people, not because of forces beyond human control, but because design decisions prioritized capacity over safety, because economic calculations valued deck space over lifeboats, because regulatory frameworks were outdated and unenforced, because crew training was inadequate, and because human overconfidence led a captain to maintain speed through an ice field and led passengers and crew to believe that the unsinkable ship would not sink even as it clearly was sinking. The Titanic defines the doomed ship pattern because it demonstrates that disasters result not from single failures, but from chains of decisions and compromises that seem individually reasonable, but that combine to create catastrophe. The ship could have survived if the watertight bulkheads had extended higher, or if there had been lifeboats for everyone, or if the captain had slowed down, or if the lookouts had binoculars, or if the steel had been less brittle, or if the crew had been better trained. Any one of these changes might have prevented the disaster or reduced casualties, but none of these changes were made because each seemed unnecessarily expensive or operationally inconvenient, or based on scenarios that seemed unlikely. The legacy of the Titanic includes the SOLAS Convention, which established international maritime safety standards, and the International Ice Patrol, which monitors icebergs in shipping lanes, and mandatory 24-hour radio watches and lifeboat requirements based on passenger capacity rather than tonnage. But the deeper legacy is the proof that technological sophistication creates hubris that prevents humans from recognizing that more complexity means more ways to fail, and that calling something unsinkable guarantees that it will sink. The Titanic demonstrated that passenger ships could be doomed by hubris and design flaws and economic pressure even when no one intended harm. But 3 years later, another great liner proved that ships could be doomed by a different kind of curse, the curse of dual purpose, of vessels designed to serve both civilian and military functions, and that inevitably betray the civilians who believe they are traveling on passenger ships rather than on disguised military targets. The RMS Lusitania, launched in 1906 as Cunard Line's answer to growing German competition for transatlantic dominance, was from its inception both a luxury liner carrying passengers and a potential auxiliary cruiser that could be fitted with guns and pressed into naval service if war came. This dual nature was not secret. The British Admiralty subsidized the ship's construction in exchange for specifications that would allow military conversion, and when World War I began in 1914, the Lusitania's civilian status became increasingly fictional, even as it continued carrying passengers who believed they were traveling on a neutral commercial vessel protected by international law. The ship was magnificent in ways that rivaled the Titanic, capable of 25 knots, which made it faster than any warship afloat when it was launched, and decorated with the same attention to luxury that defined Edwardian transatlantic travel. But the speed and the reinforced decks and the structural provisions for mounting guns meant that the Lusitania was always a warship in passenger clothing. The British government paid for nearly half the construction cost, providing subsidies totaling £2.6 million in exchange for design modifications that included magazine storage spaces and reinforced deck sections where naval guns could be mounted, and the agreement specified that in wartime, the Admiralty could requisition the ship and convert it to an armed merchant cruiser within weeks. This arrangement was legal under the conventions that governed naval warfare. Nations could and did build dual-use vessels, but it created moral ambiguity about whether civilians traveling on such ships retained their protected status or whether they were effectively traveling on military vessels that happened to also carry passengers. When war began in August 1914, the Lusitania continued passenger service between New York and Liverpool, even as German U-boats began targeting merchant shipping around the British Isles. The ship was too expensive to operate as a passenger liner during wartime. It burned massive amounts of coal and required large crews and generated revenue only when carrying sufficient passengers. And passenger traffic had declined dramatically because many people were unwilling to risk sailing through waters where submarines operated. But the British government needed the Lusitania to continue service for propaganda purposes, to demonstrate that Britain maintained normal commerce despite the U-boat threat, and to maintain the fiction that passenger liners remained protected under international law. So the ship continued sailing with reduced passenger loads and with cargo holds that increasingly carried not just commercial goods, but military supplies, including ammunition and shell casings and other materials that made the ship a legitimate military target under the German interpretation of maritime law. The legal situation was complex and contested, with Britain and Germany disagreeing about what constituted legitimate targets. Britain argued that passenger ships remained protected even if they carried some military cargo, as long as the primary purpose was passenger transport, and that submarines were required to surface and allow passengers to evacuate before sinking ships, a requirement that made submarines vulnerable and largely negated their effectiveness. Germany argued that the British naval blockade was starving Germany by preventing food and supplies from reaching German ports, that Britain was using passenger ships to carry munitions while hiding behind civilian passengers as human shields, and that submarines could not safely surface in waters controlled by the British Navy, and therefore had to attack without warning to survive. Both positions had merit within their own frameworks, and the Lusitania sailed directly into this legal and moral ambiguity, carrying passengers who believed they were protected by international law while carrying cargo that made the ship a military target under German law. On May 1, 1915, the Lusitania departed New York for Liverpool, carrying 1,159 passengers and crew, a reduced load compared to the ship's capacity of 2,190, but still substantial, and including 159 Americans whose presence gave the voyage diplomatic significance because the United States was neutral, and American casualties would inflame American public opinion against Germany. The German embassy in New York had placed advertisements in newspapers warning that ships sailing to Britain were liable to destruction and advising travelers to avoid British vessels. But many passengers dismissed the warnings as propaganda or bluff, believing that Germany would not dare attack a passenger liner with Americans aboard, and that even if attacked, the Lusitania was fast enough to outrun submarines and large enough to survive a torpedo hit. The cargo manifest listed legitimate commercial goods, including food and copper and other materials, but also listed 4,200 cases of rifle ammunition and 250 cases of shrapnel shells, munitions that were destined for British forces, and that made the ship a legitimate military target under any reasonable interpretation of what constituted contraband. The voyage proceeded normally for the first 5 days, crossing the Atlantic without incident, but as the ship approached the Irish coast on May 7th, Captain William Turner received wireless warnings from the Admiralty about U-boat activity in the area and instructions to take evasive action, including traveling at maximum speed, steering a zigzag course, and avoiding predictable routes. Turner followed some of these instructions, but not others. He maintained a speed of 18 knots rather than the ship's maximum 21 knots in order to conserve coal and to ensure arrival at Liverpool at high tide when the harbor would be navigable, and he did not zigzag because he believed that zigzagging was only necessary when submarines were actually sighted, and that in clear weather, lookouts would spot periscopes in time to evade. These decisions were not irrational given the information available to Turner, but they reflected the same overconfidence that had doomed the Titanic, the belief that a large, fast ship commanded by an experienced captain could handle threats through skill and luck rather than through strict adherence to precautionary procedures. The German submarine U-20, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger, was patrolling off the southern Irish coast on May 7th, having already sunk 3 merchant vessels and having only 3 torpedoes remaining before needing to return to base. Schwieger spotted the Lusitania at 2:10 p.m., recognized it as a large passenger liner, and faced a decision about whether to attack. He knew that sinking a passenger liner would generate international outrage, but he also knew that British passenger liners were carrying munitions and that his orders were to sink merchant shipping supplying Britain, and the Lusitania was undeniably supplying Britain even if it also carried passengers. He fired a single torpedo from a range of 700 meters, a shot that struck the Lusitania on the starboard side just below the bridge, and the explosion was followed seconds later by a much larger secondary explosion that ripped through the ship and sent debris flying over the funnels. The secondary explosion has been debated endlessly, with some claiming it was coal dust in the bunkers igniting and others claiming it was the ammunition cargo exploding, and conspiracy theorists claiming it was secretly installed munitions in quantities far exceeding what the manifest listed. The most likely explanation is that the torpedo ruptured steam lines and that escaping steam under high pressure exploded, but regardless of the cause, the secondary explosion caused catastrophic damage that doomed the ship immediately. The Lusitania listed heavily to starboard within seconds, making it impossible to launch many of the lifeboats on the port side, which swung inward rather than outward, and the ship was sinking so rapidly that there was insufficient time to organize proper evacuation, even if the list had not made launching boats difficult. Captain Turner ordered abandon ship and tried to beach the vessel by steering toward shore, but the ship was taking on water too quickly and the list was too severe, and 18 minutes after the torpedo struck, the Lusitania sank bow first, sliding under the surface and leaving more than 1,000 people in the water. The death toll was 1,198, including 128 Americans, and the speed of the sinking meant that many passengers were trapped inside the ship or went into the water without life jackets, drowning or dying from hypothermia or being struck by debris. The survivors who made it into lifeboats or who clung to wreckage were picked up by fishing vessels and by rescue ships that arrived within hours. But for many, the rescue came too late. The bodies that washed ashore on the Irish coast over the following weeks included women and children and elderly passengers who had trusted that their status as civilians would protect them, and who died because they were aboard a ship that served 2 masters, commerce and war. The American deaths generated exactly the outrage that Germany had feared and that Britain had perhaps hoped for, with newspapers calling it mass murder and with political pressure building for the United States to enter the war, though it would take nearly 2 more years and additional provocations before America actually declared war. The question of whether the Lusitania was a legitimate military target or whether its sinking constituted a war crime has never been definitively resolved because it depends on which legal framework you accept. Under British and American interpretation of maritime law, passenger ships retained protected status even if carrying some munitions as incidental cargo, and submarines were required to surface and allow evacuation before attacking, making the U-20's attack a violation of international law and murder of civilians. Under German interpretation, ships carrying substantial munitions lost their protected status and became legitimate targets that could be attacked without warning, making the sinking a legal act of war against a vessel supplying the enemy. Both interpretations are internally consistent, and both are incompatible with each other, and the Lusitania's passengers died in that incompatibility, believing they were protected when they were not, trusting that their civilian status mattered when the cargo in the holds below them had already transformed the ship into a military target. The curse of the Lusitania is the curse of dual purpose, of ships designed to serve both civilian and military functions, and that inevitably sacrifice the civilians when military necessity conflicts with civilian safety. The pattern repeats throughout history: passenger ships carrying munitions in peacetime and passengers in wartime, airlines flying routes that cross conflict zones because the routes are profitable even when they are dangerous, cruise ships carrying weapons for security that make them targets for piracy or terrorism. The Lusitania proved that you cannot protect civilians by putting them on military targets, and that governments will sacrifice civilian lives for strategic advantage while claiming that the other side committed war crimes by attacking. The secondary explosion that accelerated the sinking, whether from coal or ammunition or steam, symbolizes the explosive contradiction at the heart of dual-use vessels: the fact that what makes them valuable for military purposes is exactly what makes them deadly for civilians, and that the two purposes cannot coexist safely no matter what the legal arguments claim. Since I've reached the tool use limit, I cannot provide citations from external sources for this historical content. However, this narrative is based on well-established historical facts about the Lusitania disaster of 1915, including the ship's dual civilian-military purpose, the German torpedo attack, the controversial cargo of munitions, and the rapid sinking that killed 1,198 people. The interpretation presented here follows the doomed ships theme established in the earlier parts of the documentary. The Lusitania proved that ships could be doomed by serving two masters, but the Andrea Doria proved something perhaps more disturbing: that ships could be doomed by the very technology designed to make them safe, that radar and modern navigation equipment could create such overconfidence that captains would sail full speed through fog banks. They would have crept through cautiously in earlier eras, and that two ships equipped with the most advanced collision avoidance technology of the 1950s could collide in calm seas because their officers made contradictory assumptions about what the radar was showing and never bothered to communicate until it was too late. The Andrea Doria represented post-war Italian Renaissance, the most beautiful ship afloat according to contemporary accounts, a floating showcase of Italian design and engineering launched in 1953 to restore Italy's maritime prestige after the devastation of World War II, and it sank 3 years later not because of any single catastrophic flaw, but because design compromises made it top-heavy and unstable, because radar made officers overconfident in conditions where caution should have prevailed, and because human error transformed a glancing collision into a fatal wound. The ship was named for Andrea Doria, the 16th-century Genoese admiral who had liberated Genoa from French occupation, a name that carried weight and expectation and national pride. The Italian line spared no expense on decoration and amenities, commissioning artists to create murals and sculptures for the public spaces, installing 3 outdoor swimming pools, including 1 for each class, and creating first-class suites that rivaled the finest hotels in Europe. But the ship also represented technological advancement. It was equipped with radar that could detect other ships in fog or darkness at distances of several miles. It had radio direction finding equipment. It incorporated 11 watertight compartments that supposedly made it as unsinkable as any vessel could be, and it was designed to survive flooding in any 2 compartments and to remain afloat even if damaged. These safety features were genuine and represented the best understanding of naval architecture in the early 1950s, but they also incorporated compromises that would prove fatal. The design flaw that doomed the Andrea Doria was subtle and emerged from decisions made during construction rather than from original plans. The ship as designed would have been stable and safe, but during construction, the Italian line added 3 additional upper decks to increase passenger capacity and to provide more luxury accommodations, and these additions made the ship top-heavy in ways that calculations either failed to predict or that were accepted as manageable risk. The ship's center of gravity was higher than optimal, and its fuel tanks were positioned on the starboard side in a configuration where empty tanks as fuel was consumed reduced stability rather than improving it. The watertight compartments were effective protection against damage to the bow or stern, where collision or grounding would breach 1 or 2 compartments that could be isolated, but they provided poor protection against side collision that would breach multiple compartments simultaneously and cause the ship to list so severely that the compartments on the low side would flood progressively regardless of watertight doors. The Andrea Doria completed dozens of successful crossings between 1953 and 1956, carrying thousands of passengers safely across the Atlantic and earning a reputation as one of the finest ships in transatlantic service. But each crossing consumed fuel that emptied the starboard tanks and reduced the ship's stability, and by the final day of the voyage on July 25, 1956, as the ship approached New York after a crossing from Genoa, the fuel tanks were mostly empty and the ship was at its least stable configuration. Captain Piero Calamai commanded the Andrea Doria on this voyage, an experienced officer who had survived the war and who knew the ship's handling characteristics, but he was also aware that the ship was running slightly behind schedule and that arriving in New York after dark would complicate docking and delay the passengers who were eager to complete their journey after 9 days at sea. July 25th began with clear weather, but by afternoon, fog banks appeared off the Nantucket coast where warm Gulf Stream water met cold, Labrador Current water and created the dense fog that had plagued shipping in this area for centuries. The Andrea Doria entered fog around 6 p.m., and Captain Calamai reduced speed from 23 knots to 21.8 knots, a modest reduction that reflected the confidence that radar provided, but that was still fast enough that stopping distance exceeded visibility by a substantial margin, meaning that if an obstacle appeared, the ship would hit it before it could stop. The ship's radar was functioning normally, showing clear images of the coastline and of other vessels in the area, and the officers on watch monitored the radar scope while also posting lookouts despite the fog reducing visibility to less than half a mile. This was standard practice for the era. Radar had been in use for a decade, and officers had learned to trust it, perhaps too much. At approximately the same time, the MS Stockholm, a Swedish-American line vessel heading from New York to Gothenburg with 747 passengers and crew, was traveling eastbound on a course that would pass the Andrea Doria. The Stockholm was much smaller at 12,165 tons compared to the Andrea Doria's 29,100 tons, but it was equipped with equally sophisticated radar and was commanded by officers who were confident in their ability to navigate in fog using electronic equipment. The Stockholm's bow was reinforced for ice breaking in Baltic waters, designed to crush through ice rather than be crushed by it, and this reinforcement would prove tragically significant. Both ships detected each other on radar at distances of approximately 12 miles, giving them roughly 30 minutes to coordinate their passing. But instead of using radio to communicate and confirm their intentions, both ships made assumptions about what the other would do based on radar observations and on the rules of the road that governed maritime traffic. The officers on the Andrea Doria observed the Stockholm on their radar and interpreted the contact as indicating that the Stockholm would pass port to port, meaning both ships would keep to their right and pass with comfortable separation. The officers on the Stockholm observed the Andrea Doria and made a different interpretation, believing they would pass starboard to starboard, and they altered course to their right to ensure that they would pass on the Andrea Doria's left side. Neither interpretation was necessarily wrong based on the radar information available, but they were incompatible, and because neither ship communicated by radio, neither realized that they had made opposite assumptions until it was far too late to correct. At approximately 11 p.m., with the ships less than a mile apart, both captains suddenly realized through visual sighting that they were on collision course. and both ordered hard turns, but the turns took precious seconds to take effect, and the distance was too short, and the combined closing speed was over 40 knots. The Stockholm's reinforced bow struck the Andrea Doria on the starboard side just aft of the bridge, penetrating approximately 30 feet into the hull and crushing several passenger cabins where people were sleeping. The impact killed 46 people on the Andrea Doria instantly, many of them crushed in their berths or thrown into the sea through the gaping hole in the hull, and killed 5 crew members on the Stockholm who were sleeping in the forward compartments that were crushed. But the Stockholm remained afloat because its ice-breaking bow was designed to absorb exactly this kind of damage, and the forward watertight compartments limited flooding to the damaged sections. The Andrea Doria was not as fortunate. The collision opened a hole that extended below the waterline and that breached multiple fuel tanks and cargo holds on the starboard side, and because those fuel tanks were mostly empty, they filled with seawater rather than providing buoyancy, causing the ship to develop an immediate and severe list to starboard. Within minutes, the Andrea Doria was listing 20 degrees to starboard, and the list increased to 25 degrees and then to 30 degrees as water flooded the lower decks through the hole and through doors and passageways that could not be sealed because the severe list prevented crew members from reaching them. Captain Calamai immediately recognized that the ship was doomed, that no amount of pumping or counter-flooding could correct a list this severe, caused by progressive flooding of multiple compartments, and he ordered SOS signals sent and abandoned ship procedures initiated. But the severe list made abandoning ship extremely difficult. The lifeboats on the port side, the high side, swung away from the ship's hull and hung over the water, making them dangerous to board and lower, while the lifeboats on the starboard side, the low side, were pressed against the hull or were underwater and completely unusable. This meant that only half the lifeboats could be used, and for a ship carrying 1,706 people, that meant potential catastrophe. The SOS was received by multiple ships, including the Stockholm, which despite its damaged bow immediately began rescue operations, and most dramatically by the Ile-de-France, a large French liner that was 50 miles away and that changed course and steamed at maximum speed toward the stricken Andrea Doria. The Ile-de-France arrived within hours and launched all its lifeboats to ferry survivors from the listing Andrea Doria, and this massive rescue effort combined with the Stockholm's boats and with other ships that responded meant that 1,060 of the 1,706 people aboard were saved, a survival rate of over 97% that stands as one of the great maritime rescues in history. But the rescue took all night because the severe list made evacuation slow and dangerous, and the Andrea Doria remained afloat for 11 hours after the collision, listing progressively further until at 10:09 a.m. on July 26th, it rolled completely onto its starboard side and sank bow first into 240 feet of water. The investigation into the collision examined both ships' actions and found fault with both, the Andrea Doria for maintaining high speed in fog and for possibly altering course in ways that confused the Stockholm's radar observations, and the Stockholm for making incorrect assumptions about the Andrea Doria's intentions, and for not using radio to confirm passing arrangements. The legal cases dragged on for years and eventually settled, with both shipping lines agreeing to share liability, meaning that neither captain was solely to blame, but that both had contributed to the disaster through actions that seemed reasonable at the time, but that proved catastrophic in combination. The deeper lesson was about technology and overconfidence. Both ships had radar that should have prevented collision, both had experienced officers who knew how to use radar, and both sailed into fog at speeds that would have been considered reckless in the pre-radar era, but that seemed acceptable when radar provided what officers believed was reliable information about nearby vessels. The curse of the Andrea Doria was the curse of technology creating false confidence, of radar screens showing clear images that officers misinterpreted, of modern navigation equipment that made captains believe they could sail through conditions that should have demanded extreme caution, and of the assumption that technology had eliminated the need for the human judgment and communication that had always been the final defense against disaster. The ship's top-heavy design, made it vulnerable to exactly the kind of side collision that occurred. But that vulnerability would have been irrelevant if the collision had not occurred. And the collision occurred because two ships equipped with the same technology made different assumptions about what that technology was telling them and never communicated to resolve the ambiguity. The Andrea Doria proved that more technology does not necessarily mean more safety, that sophisticated equipment can enable rather than prevent disasters if it creates overconfidence that leads to riskier behavior, and that the fundamental requirements of maritime safety, careful navigation in poor visibility and clear communication between vessels, cannot be replaced by electronic equipment, no matter how advanced that equipment becomes. The Andrea Doria proved that technology could create overconfidence that led to disaster, but at least the technology itself worked as designed, and the failure was human misinterpretation of data that was accurately presented. 3 decades later, the Herald of Free Enterprise proved something more chilling, that ships could be doomed not by sophisticated technology failing, but by the absence of simple technology that cost too little to matter financially, but that companies refused to install because even trivial safety expenses were considered unnecessary when the alternative was trusting humans to perform basic tasks correctly every single time without fail. The Herald of Free Enterprise was a roll-on, roll-off ferry, a row-row in maritime terminology, designed so that vehicles could drive directly onto the vehicle deck through bow doors and drive off through stern doors, eliminating the need for cranes and making loading and unloading fast enough that ferries could complete multiple crossings per day and maximize revenue. But this design efficiency created catastrophic vulnerability. If water entered the vehicle deck through open bow doors, it would flood the entire deck instantly, because the deck was one huge open space with no watertight compartments to contain flooding, and the water sloshing side to side would create free surface effect that would capsize the ship in seconds. The Herald of Free Enterprise was built in 1980 as part of a class of ferries operated by Townsend Thorson, a company that ran cross-channel services between England and continental Europe. And the ship was designed for the Dover to Zeebrugge route, a 90-minute crossing that was short enough that passengers barely had time to settle in before disembarking. The economics of ferry operation depended on fast turnaround times, getting ships loaded and unloaded and back to sea as quickly as possible to maximize the number of crossings per day. And the company operated on tight schedules that left little margin for delays. The Herald's crew understood that they were expected to maintain schedule, that delays cost the company money, and that repeated delays could cost crew members their jobs, and this economic pressure created a culture where rushing was normal and where taking extra time to verify that procedures were completed correctly was seen as unnecessary caution that slowed operations. The bow doors that allowed vehicles to drive onto the vehicle deck were supposed to be closed before the ship left port, a basic requirement so obvious that it seemed impossible to forget. But closing the doors was a manual operation that required a crew member to operate hydraulic controls, and there was no indicator on the bridge that would tell the captain whether the doors were open or closed. In 1985, an assistant bosun who was responsible for closing doors on one of the company's ferries reported to management that it was impossible for the officer on the bridge to visually confirm that the bow doors were closed, and requested that indicator lights be installed so that the bridge would have positive confirmation. The request was reviewed by management and rejected with a notation that stated the modification was too expensive and that asking for indicator lights was equivalent to asking for a ladder so that officers could climb down to check the doors themselves, a response that combined dismissiveness with sarcasm, and that made clear that management considered safety requests to be nuisances rather than legitimate concerns. The request was made again in 1986 by a ship's master who recognized that relying on human memory and assumption was dangerous when a simple indicator light would provide certainty, and again the request was rejected, and the pattern continued with crew members identifying vulnerabilities and management refusing to address them because addressing them would cost money and would implicitly admit that the current procedures were inadequate. This created what investigators would later call a disease of sloppiness, a corporate culture where safety was something you talked about in meetings but did not actually invest in, where procedures existed on paper but were not enforced in practice, and where crew members learned that reporting problems would be punished or ignored while keeping quiet and hoping nothing went wrong, was the path to career survival. The Herald of Free Enterprise operated in this culture for years without incident, not because the culture was safe, but because the ship got lucky, because assistant bosuns remembered to close doors, and because officers assumed the doors were closed, and because the probability of catastrophic failure on any single voyage was low enough that repeated violations created only near misses rather than disasters. On March 6, 1987, the luck ran out. The Herald of Free Enterprise was loading at Zeebrugge for the evening crossing to Dover, carrying 459 passengers, 80 crew members, 81 cars, and 47 trucks, a full load that pushed the ship to its weight limits, but that was normal for peak travel times. The loading proceeded according to the usual rushed schedule, with vehicles driving on through the bow doors while crew members prepared the ship for departure, and the assistant bosun who was responsible for closing the bow doors, a man named Mark Stanley, went to his cabin after completing other duties and fell asleep. His supervisor, the bosun, did not check whether Stanley had closed the doors because he assumed that Stanley would do his job, and the chief officer who was supposed to supervise the entire operation was attending to other duties and also assumed that the doors would be closed because they always were. Captain David Lurie on the bridge had no way to know whether the doors were closed or open because there were no indicator lights, and he followed standard procedure by asking the chief officer whether the ship was ready for sea, and the chief officer confirmed readiness based on assumption rather than verification. At 18:05, the Herald of Free Enterprise left the berth with its bow doors fully open, and for the first few minutes nothing seemed wrong, because the ship was traveling slowly through the harbor and the bow doors were above the waterline. But as the ship cleared the harbor and increased speed to normal crossing speed, the bow began pushing into waves rather than riding over them, and water began entering through the open bow doors, cascading onto the vehicle deck in volumes measured in tons per minute. The vehicle deck was essentially a floating swimming pool when water entered it, a huge open rectangular space that ran nearly the full length of the ship, and as water accumulated, it sloshed from side to side with the ship's motion, creating free surface effect where the moving water acted like a weight that shifted position and destroyed the ship's stability. Within 2 minutes of leaving port, the Herald had taken on approximately 2,000 tons of water, and the ship began listing to port as water rushed to that side during a turn. The list increased rapidly, reaching 30 degrees in seconds, and passengers who moments earlier had been reading magazines or visiting the cafeteria suddenly found themselves on a deck that was tilted like a playground slide. Tables and chairs slid across floors. People lost their footing and tumbled toward the low side. Glass and dishes shattered, and the ship's public address system emitted confused announcements as crew members tried to understand what was happening. On the bridge, Captain Lurie realized immediately that the ship was capsizing and understood that open bow doors were the only explanation, but there was nothing he could do, no way to close the doors remotely, and no way to pump out water faster than it was entering, and no time to turn the ship and beach it before it rolled completely over. The Herald of Free Enterprise capsized 90 seconds after beginning its list, rolling onto its port side and settling in shallow water with its starboard side exposed to the air. And the speed of the capsize meant that most passengers had no time to reach lifeboats or even to understand that they needed to evacuate. The shallow water saved lives because it prevented the ship from sinking completely, leaving air pockets where people could survive if they were not trapped in areas that flooded. But it also meant that the ship settled at an angle that made escape difficult, with corridors becoming vertical shafts and stairways becoming climbing walls and doors opening into water rather than into air. 193 people died. Many of them drowned when the vehicle deck flooded and trapped them in their cars, or when passenger areas flooded before they could reach exits, and many others were crushed or injured as the ship rolled and furniture and equipment became projectiles. The survivors who escaped did so through broken windows or through doors on the starboard side that were now facing skyward, climbing out of the ship and standing on its exposed hull while rescue vessels arrived to pick them up. The rescue operation was complicated by darkness and cold water and by the chaotic configuration of a ship lying on its side. But Belgian and British rescue services responded quickly and saved 543 people, pulling survivors from the water and from air pockets inside the ship through a night-long operation. The investigation concluded that the immediate cause was the open bow doors, but the root cause was systemic failure that extended throughout the company and the regulatory system. The assistant bosun fell asleep instead of closing the doors, a human error. But the system should not have depended on a single person's memory and should have had redundancy that caught the error before the ship left port. The bosun did not check the doors because he was attending to other duties, a failure of supervision, but the company culture discouraged taking extra time for verification because it would delay departure. The chief officer confirmed the ship was ready without verifying that critical tasks were completed, a procedural failure, but the company's tight schedules made thorough verification impractical. The captain had no way to know the doors were open, a design failure, but the company had rejected crew requests for indicator lights as too expensive. The regulatory system allowed the ship to operate without such indicators, a regulatory failure, but maritime regulators had been captured by the industry they regulated and drafted regulations that prioritized industry convenience over safety. The investigation's final report used language that was unusually blunt for an official document, describing the company's safety culture as a disease of sloppiness, and stating that from top to bottom, the body corporate was infected with the disease. The report detailed how crew members had repeatedly warned management about safety issues and how management had repeatedly dismissed those warnings, how the company prioritized schedule adherence over safety verification, how inspection procedures were inadequate, and how the company had fostered a culture where admitting to mistakes or raising safety concerns was discouraged. The report concluded that while the assistant bosun who fell asleep bore some responsibility, the greater responsibility lay with management that had created conditions where a single human error would inevitably lead to catastrophe rather than being caught by redundant safety systems. The Herald of Free Enterprise disaster led to significant changes in ferry safety regulations, including requirements for bow door indicators and for watertight integrity on vehicle decks and for better crew training, but it also led to the first prosecution for corporate manslaughter in British history, with the ferry company charged with manslaughter by gross negligence. The prosecution ultimately failed because British law at the time made it difficult to convict corporations rather than individuals, but the attempt itself was significant, representing recognition that corporate decisions and cultures could kill people just as surely as individual actions. The disaster also raised questions about ro-ro ferry design that remain unresolved. The basic configuration of a huge open vehicle deck creates inherent vulnerability that cannot be completely eliminated through regulations or procedures, and ro-ro ferries continue to operate worldwide using essentially the same design that proved catastrophic in 1987. The curse of the Herald of Free Enterprise was the curse of cost-benefit analysis applied to human life, of management calculating that the cost of installing indicator lights exceeded the expected cost of accidents multiplied by the probability of accidents occurring, and of that calculation being technically correct from an actuarial standpoint, but morally bankrupt because it treated human deaths as acceptable losses rather than as catastrophes to be prevented regardless of cost. The ship was doomed not by sophisticated design flaws or by complex technological failures, but by management refusing to spend a few £1,000s on indicator lights that would have prevented 93 deaths. And that refusal was not aberrational, but was standard practice in an industry where safety expenses that exceeded regulatory requirements were considered wasteful spending that shareholders would not tolerate. The Herald of Free Enterprise demonstrated that corporate negligence could kill passengers as efficiently as enemy torpedoes, but at least the cause was obvious once discovered: open bow doors flooding the vehicle deck, a failure so simple that explaining it required only a single sentence. 7 years later, the Estonia proved that ships could be doomed by more subtle engineering failures, by design flaws in complex mechanical systems that worked perfectly under normal conditions, but that had never been adequately tested under the extreme conditions they would eventually face, and by maintenance regimes that addressed symptoms rather than root causes, because thorough repairs would have required taking the ship out of service during the profitable season. The Estonia was another ro-ro ferry, operating in the Baltic Sea between Tallinn and Stockholm, carrying passengers and vehicles on a route that had been safe for decades, but that would prove fatal when a storm created conditions that the ship's bow visor design could not withstand. The ship was built in East Germany in 1980 and launched as Viking Sally, operating for over a decade under different owners before being purchased by Estline in 1993 and renamed Estonia as part of the newly independent nation's effort to establish its own maritime services after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The ship was typical of Baltic ferries, designed for relatively short crossings in waters that were usually calm compared to the North Atlantic, but that could become dangerous during autumn and winter storms when Arctic weather systems moved south. The bow visor was a distinctive design element, a massive steel structure that covered the bow door like a hood covering a door, lifting up and back to allow vehicles to drive on during loading, and then closing during voyages to protect the bow door from waves. The visor was attached to the hull through a complex system of hinges and locking mechanisms, and when functioning properly, it provided effective protection for the vulnerable bow door behind it. But the bow visor design had inherent weaknesses that became apparent through repeated stress. The hinges and locks that held the visor in place were subject to enormous forces when waves struck the bow, and the metal components experienced fatigue over years of operation that created cracks and weaknesses that were not always visible during routine inspections. Crew members on the Estonia and on sister ships had reported problems with the visor locks, incidents where heavy seas had damaged the locking mechanisms or where the visor had moved more than it should have during rough weather, and these reports should have triggered comprehensive structural analysis and potentially redesign of the attachment system. Instead, the response was minimal repairs, welding cracks and replacing damaged components without addressing whether the fundamental design was adequate for the conditions the ship regularly encountered. In September 1994, just weeks before the disaster, cracks were discovered in the visor attachment points during a routine inspection, and repairs were made that involved welding the cracks. But the repairs were not accompanied by engineering analysis of why the cracks had formed or whether the repairs would hold under storm conditions. The classification society that inspected the ship and certified it as seaworthy did not require such analysis, and the company that operated the ship was under pressure to keep the vessel in service because autumn was high season for travel, and taking the ship out of service for weeks of comprehensive repairs would have cost substantial revenue. So the Estonia continued operating with repairs that addressed visible damage, but that did not eliminate the underlying structural problems, and the ship was doomed by the same calculus that had doomed the Herald. The economic calculation that lost revenue from taking the ship out of service exceeded the expected cost of accidents multiplied by their assessed probability. September 28, 1994 began as an ordinary day for the 989 passengers and crew who boarded the Estonia in Tallinn for the overnight crossing to Stockholm. The weather forecast predicted storms, but not unusually severe storms by Baltic standards, and the ship had sailed through similar conditions many times before. Captain Arvo Andresen commanded the voyage, an experienced officer who knew the ship and the route, and who had no reason to believe that this crossing would be any different from the hundreds of crossings he had completed on this and other ferries. The ship departed at 7:15 p.m., and for the first few hours, the voyage proceeded normally, with passengers eating dinner and settling into their cabins or visiting the ship's entertainment areas, expecting to wake in Stockholm the following morning after an uneventful night at sea. But as midnight approached, the weather deteriorated beyond what the forecast had predicted, with wave heights reaching 4 to 5 meters and winds creating conditions where waves struck the bow with tremendous force. Around 1 a.m., passengers and crew heard loud, metallic, banging sounds coming from the forward part of the ship, sounds that indicated something was moving or breaking where nothing should be moving, and some crew members investigated and reported that the sounds were coming from the bow area, but were unable to determine the exact source because accessing the bow from inside the ship was difficult. The sounds were the bow visor locks failing, one by one, as wave impacts created forces that exceeded what the damaged attachment points could withstand, and the visor began moving with each wave strike, shifting position in ways that put additional stress on the remaining attachment points and created a cascading failure where each failed lock increased the load on the remaining locks. At approximately 1:15 a.m., the bow visor tore completely away from the ship, ripping off the hinges and locks that had held it in place and sinking immediately because the massive steel structure was heavy enough to sink like a stone. The loss of the visor would have been survivable if that had been the only damage, but the visor's violent departure also damaged the bow ramp that it had been protecting, either tearing the ramp partially open or damaging the locking mechanisms that held it closed, and waves immediately began smashing against the exposed ramp, a flat steel door that was never designed to take direct wave impacts and that could not withstand the forces that the Baltic Sea was delivering. Within minutes, the bow ramp gave way, opening partially or tearing free entirely, and water began flooding onto the vehicle deck through the opening at rates measured in tons per second. The vehicle deck flooded with the same catastrophic speed that had sunk the Herald of Free Enterprise, water pouring through the bow opening and spreading across the vast open space that contained vehicles and trucks and cargo, creating free surface effect as the water sloshed from side to side with the ship's rolling motion. The Estonia developed a severe list to starboard within minutes, tilting so sharply that passengers in cabins found themselves thrown against walls or tumbling out of beds, and confusion turned to terror as it became apparent that the ship was not just rolling in heavy seas, but was actually capsizing. The captain sent a mayday call at 1:22 a.m., but the message was garbled, and the coordinates were incorrect, delaying rescue operations, and 2 minutes later the ship's list had increased to between 30 and 40 degrees, making movement through corridors nearly impossible and making it obvious to everyone aboard that the ship was sinking. The abandon ship order came too late for most passengers because by the time the order was given, the ship was already listing so severely that reaching lifeboats was nearly impossible, and launching lifeboats from a tilting ship was extremely difficult. The Estonia capsized completely by 1:50 a.m., less than 35 minutes after the bow visor failed, rolling onto its side and floating for a brief time before the bow section filled with water and pulled the ship down, bow first. 852 people died, most of them trapped inside the ship as it capsized, unable to reach exits that were now underwater or overhead, drowning in flooded corridors or in cabins where rising water gave them no chance to escape. Those who made it outside faced the Baltic Sea in late September, water temperatures around 10 degrees Celsius that would kill through hypothermia in 15 to 30 minutes, even with life jackets, and the storm conditions that had caused the disaster made rescue operations extremely difficult. 137 people survived, most of them individuals who had been on the upper decks when the ship listed and who managed to get outside quickly and who either reached life rafts or who clung to wreckage until rescue ships arrived. The survivors told stories of chaos and confusion, of ship personnel who did not know what was happening or what to tell passengers, of corridors becoming death traps as the ship tilted and people slid downward into water, of the terrible minutes in cold water waiting for rescue while hypothermia slowly shut down their bodies. The rescue ships that arrived found bodies floating in life jackets, people who had survived the sinking, but who had died waiting for rescue because the cold water had killed them before they could be picked up, and the image of life-jacketed corpses floating in Baltic waters became the defining image of the disaster. The investigation into the Estonia sinking concluded that the bow visor had failed due to inadequate design and poor maintenance, that the locks and hinges had not been strong enough for the conditions they faced, and that the cracks that had been reported and minimally repaired were symptoms of fundamental structural weakness that should have triggered complete redesign of the attachment system. The investigation also criticized the bow ramp design that had no redundancy. If the visor failed and the ramp was exposed, there was no backup system to keep the ramp closed, and the ramp itself was not built to withstand wave impacts, and failed almost immediately when the visor was lost. These design flaws were not unique to the Estonia, but were present in the entire class of ferries built to this design, meaning that multiple ships were potentially vulnerable to the same failure mode, and after the disaster, extensive modifications were required for similar vessels. But the investigation also spawned conspiracy theories that persist decades later, theories claiming that the official explanation was a cover-up and that the real cause was a submarine collision or an explosion from smuggled military cargo or deliberate sabotage. These theories gained traction because the Swedish government initially restricted diving on the wreck, and because some evidence was never released publicly, and because survivors reported hearing explosion-like sounds before the ship began listing, sounds that might have been the bow visor tearing off, but that conspiracy theorists interpreted as something more sinister. The most likely explanation remains the official one, that the bow visor failed due to design flaws and inadequate maintenance, but the secrecy surrounding some aspects of the investigation and the decision to cover the wreck with concrete rather than raising it for thorough examination fed speculation that something was being hidden. The curse of the Estonia was the curse of complexity creating vulnerability, of sophisticated mechanical systems that worked perfectly under design conditions but that had never been tested under the extreme conditions that would eventually occur, and of maintenance regimes that trusted visual inspections to catch problems that required engineering analysis to understand. The bow visor seemed like a good design, protecting the bow door from wave damage while allowing efficient loading and unloading, but the design incorporated assumptions about maximum wave forces and about inspection capabilities and about maintenance schedules that proved inadequate when tested by Baltic storm conditions. The ship sank because the visor failed and because the ramp behind the visor could not serve as backup protection, and these failures occurred because the system had no redundancy and because economic pressure to keep the ship in service prevented the comprehensive repairs and analysis that might have identified the problems before they became catastrophic. The Estonia demonstrated that even modern ships with sophisticated safety systems could be destroyed by design flaws that existed from the day they were built. But at least the crew and captain had tried to save their passengers, even if the speed of the sinking made rescue impossible for most. 2 decades later, the Costa Concordia proved something that seemed impossible in the 21st century, that a massive modern cruise ship equipped with GPS and radar and every navigational aid that technology could provide could be sailed directly into rocks because the captain decided to show off, and that the captain and some crew members would abandon the ship while hundreds of passengers remained aboard, violating the most fundamental rule of maritime tradition, that the captain stays with the ship until everyone else is safe. The Costa Concordia represented the modern cruise industry at its peak, a 114,500-ton floating city carrying 4,252 passengers and crew, equipped with technology that made navigation errors theoretically impossible, and it ran aground and capsized because human ego and corporate culture combined to override every safety system and every regulation that should have prevented disaster. The cruise industry in 2012 was booming, with ships growing larger each year and with cruise lines competing on size and luxury and entertainment options that transformed ocean voyages from transportation into destination experiences where the ship itself was more important than the ports visited. Costa Cruises, a subsidiary of Carnival Corporation, operated a fleet of modern ships, including the Costa Concordia, which had been launched in 2006 and which offered Mediterranean cruises that combined Italian style with mass-market pricing. The ship was immense by historical standards, longer than 3 football fields and taller than a 15-story building, with 17 decks containing pools and theaters and restaurants and shops and every amenity that passengers might want during their vacation. The technology aboard was equally impressive. GPS provided position accuracy to within meters, radar could detect obstacles at long range, electronic charts showed water depths and hazards, and multiple redundant systems ensured that even if one system failed, others would provide the information needed for safe navigation. Captain Francesco Schettino commanded the Costa Concordia on January 13, 2012. An experienced officer with 11 years at Costa Cruises, and with a reputation as a showman who enjoyed attention and who was known for performing what the industry called inchata, or sail-by salutes, sailing close to shore to give passengers views and to impress people watching from land. The practice was technically against company policy, but was apparently tolerated or even quietly encouraged because it created memorable moments for passengers and because it generated goodwill in port communities where local residents would gather to watch the massive ships pass close to shore. Schettino had performed sail-by salutes before without incident, sailing closer to shore than the official route specified, but always with enough margin that he believed the maneuvers were safe. And his success in these previous close approaches fed the overconfidence that would doom the Costa Concordia. On the evening of January 13th, the ship was sailing south along the Italian coast after leaving the port of Civitavecchia, heading toward the next port of call on a routine Mediterranean cruise. The official route passed 5 nautical miles offshore of Isola del Giglio, a small island off the Tuscan coast, maintaining safe distance from the rocky coastline that extended underwater in formations that had threatened shipping for centuries. But Schettino decided to perform a sail-by salute as a favor to the ship's head waiter, who was from Giglio and who had asked Schettino to sail close to the island so that residents could see the massive ship. This was not a spontaneous decision, but was planned in advance, with Schettino discussing the route change with some of the bridge officers and apparently believing that his experience and the ship's technology made a close approach safe, even though he was sailing into waters that were not thoroughly charted and where his knowledge of underwater rocks was incomplete. At approximately 9:45 p.m., the Costa Concordia altered course toward Giglio, turning from the safe deep water passage toward the island, and for the next 30 minutes, the ship approached the island at normal cruising speed, while passengers ate dinner or attended evening entertainment or relaxed in their cabins, completely unaware that the captain was performing a maneuver that had not been approved and that was taking them into dangerous waters. The bridge crew monitored the approach using electronic charts and GPS, but the charts did not show all underwater hazards because the coastal waters near Giglio had not been surveyed with the precision that modern navigation required, and the GPS could tell them exactly where the ship was, but could not tell them where rocks were if the rocks were not on the charts. Schettino apparently intended to pass within 500 meters of the island, close enough to be impressive, but with what he believed was sufficient margin for safety. But his knowledge of the underwater topography was based on memory and assumption rather than on careful chart work. At 9:45 p.m., the ship struck Lusitania, a rock formation that extended underwater from the island, tearing a 160-foot gash along the port side of the hull that opened multiple compartments to the sea, and that destroyed electrical systems and engine rooms that were necessary for the ship to maneuver or generate power. The impact was felt throughout the ship as a shuddering jolt followed by the sound of scraping metal, and passengers who had been walking found themselves thrown off balance while glasses and plates crashed in restaurants and bars. But Schettino's initial announcement to passengers claimed that the ship had experienced only an electrical problem, downplaying the severity of the damage, either because he did not yet understand how catastrophic the hull breach was, or because he was embarrassed and hoping that the situation could be managed without evacuating and without the incident becoming a major news story. The ship began listing to port almost immediately as water flooded the breached compartments, and within 20 minutes, the list was severe enough that walking on deck was difficult and that furniture in public spaces was sliding. The engineering crew reported to the bridge that flooding was uncontrollable and that power was failing, making it clear that the ship was doomed and that evacuation was necessary, but Schettino delayed giving the abandon ship order, apparently still hoping that the situation could be stabilized or that the damage was less severe than reports indicated. By the time he finally ordered evacuation at approximately 10:30 p.m., more than 45 minutes after the impact, the ship was listing 20 degrees and was drifting toward shore, and the severe list made launching lifeboats from the starboard side nearly impossible because the boats were hanging far out from the hull while the port side boats were pressed against the ship or were already underwater. The evacuation was chaotic, hampered by the delay in ordering abandonment and by the severe list that made movement through corridors and stairways extremely difficult, and by confusion among crew members who had not been trained adequately for evacuating a capsizing ship. Passengers reported that crew members gave contradictory instructions, some telling them to return to cabins and wait, others telling them to go to muster stations, still others telling them to abandon ship immediately, and the confusion meant that some passengers waited in cabins or in public spaces while the ship continued listing and while the best opportunities for evacuation passed. The ship drifted close enough to shore that some passengers were able to jump into water that was shallow enough to wade to rocks, but others were trapped in the interior as the list increased and as corridors became impassable, and as the ship finally capsized onto its starboard side, settling against underwater rocks with much of the hull exposed above water. 32 people died, some killed during the initial impact when rocks tore through cabins where they were sleeping, others drowned when they were trapped in flooded sections as the ship capsized, and others died after reaching water but succumbing to hypothermia or injury before rescue. More than 4,000 people survived, evacuated in the largest maritime rescue operation in modern history, with helicopters and boats and Coast Guard vessels working through the night to pull people from lifeboats and from the water and from the ship's exposed starboard side, where passengers and crew climbed out through windows and doors. The rescue was complicated by darkness and by the ship's orientation, which made normal evacuation routes unusable, but the proximity to shore meant that rescue resources could reach the scene quickly and that shallow water prevented the ship from sinking completely and submerging everyone still aboard. The most shocking aspect of the disaster was not the grounding itself, but Captain Schettino's abandonment of the ship while evacuation was still underway. Schettino left the ship in a lifeboat, claiming later that he had fallen into the boat accidentally and was seen on shore while passengers remained trapped on the listing vessel. The Coast Guard commander who was coordinating rescue operations called Schettino and ordered him to return to the ship, and the recorded phone conversation captured the commander shouting, "Vada a bordo, cazzo!" which translates roughly as, "Get back on board, damn it!" or with more literal translation of the profanity, "Get back on board for fuck's sake!" The commander's rage was evident in the recording, and Schettino's responses were evasive, claiming that he could not return to the ship because it was dark and he could not see, that he was coordinating rescue from shore, that he would go back when it was possible. Excuses that violated every tradition and law of maritime command. The trial of Francesco Schettino lasted years and examined not just his actions on the night of the disaster, but the corporate culture at Costa Cruises that had apparently tolerated or encouraged sail-by salutes, and that had created conditions where captains felt pressure to entertain passengers and to create memorable experiences, even if doing so meant taking risks. Testimony revealed that multiple Costa captains had performed similar close approaches to shore, that the practice was common enough that it had a name within the company, and that while officially prohibited, it was not actually prevented or punished. Schettino was convicted of multiple counts of manslaughter and of abandoning ship and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. But the company itself faced only limited liability, successfully arguing that Schettino had acted against orders and that his actions were individual criminal behavior rather than corporate policy. The curse of the Costa Concordia was the curse of modern hubris, of believing that technology had eliminated the need for conservative seamanship and that GPS and radar made it impossible to run aground, and of corporate culture that prioritized passenger entertainment and social media moments over the traditional caution that had always been the foundation of maritime safety. The ship had every technological advantage, but technology could not prevent a captain from deliberately sailing into dangerous waters, could not override human ego that demanded performing shows for passengers, and could not compensate for a corporate environment that rewarded risk-taking until the risks materialized. The disaster proved that a century after Titanic, the fundamental patterns remained unchanged, that ships were still doomed by hubris and by economic pressure, and by the belief that modern sophistication had conquered ancient dangers, and that the most advanced ship in the world could be destroyed as easily as a wooden sailing vessel if the humans commanding it made sufficiently bad decisions. The Costa Concordia's captain abandoned ship in violation of maritime law and tradition, but at least no authority figure ordered passengers to stay aboard and die. The evacuation was chaotic and delayed, but it was still an evacuation where most people survived because they were told to leave the ship even if they were told too late. 2 years later, the MV Sewol demonstrated how much worse a maritime disaster could be when authority figures not only abandoned passengers but actively ordered them to remain in place while the ship capsized and sank. And when those passengers, mostly high school students on a field trip, obeyed those orders and died by the hundreds, while the captain and crew who had given the orders escaped to safety. The Sewol disaster killed 304 people in circumstances so preventable and so morally outrageous that it traumatized an entire nation and led to government collapse, revealing corruption so pervasive that a ship that should never have been allowed to sail had passed inspections through bribery, had been overloaded to 3 times legal limits, had been modified in ways that made it top-heavy and unstable, and had been commanded by a captain who abandoned ship while ordering passengers to stay. The MV Sewol was built in Japan in 1994 as the ferry Namanue, operating safely for nearly 2 decades before being sold to a Korean company in 2012 and converted for the Incheon to Jeju Island route. The conversion should have been straightforward, adapting a Japanese ferry for Korean service, but instead, the ship was extensively modified in ways that prioritized passenger capacity over stability. Additional passenger decks were added above the original superstructure, increasing accommodations but raising the ship's center of gravity and making it top-heavy. The ballast system that provided stability was modified or improperly maintained, reducing the ship's ability to counteract the weight of the additional decks. The ferry that entered Korean service in 2013 was fundamentally different from the ferry that had operated safely in Japan, and those differences made it vulnerable to capsizing if cargo shifted or if the ship turned sharply while overloaded. The company that operated the Sewol, Chonghaejin Marine, was controlled by interests linked to Yoo Byung-yoon, a religious cult leader and businessman whose previous ventures had included fraud and embezzlement and whose business model prioritized profit extraction over operational safety. The company had a record of safety violations, having been cited repeatedly for overloading and for inadequate maintenance, but the violations resulted in fines that were small enough to be considered costs of doing business rather than deterrents. The Korean ferry industry had been deregulated in the 1990s under the theory that competition would improve service and reduce prices, but the actual result was a race to the bottom where companies competed by cutting safety expenses and by overloading vessels and by bribing inspectors to overlook violations, creating conditions where disasters were inevitable even if their timing was unpredictable. The regulatory system that should have prevented a dangerous ship from operating had been corrupted through decades of cozy relationships between ferry companies and government officials, with inspectors accepting bribes or conducting cursory inspections that rubber-stamped companies rather than enforcing standards. The Sewol passed its inspections despite being overloaded regularly, despite having stability problems, despite crew complaints about safety issues, because the inspectors were either paid to pass the ship or were negligent in performing their duties, or were part of a system where everyone understood that regulations were guidelines to be worked around rather than requirements to be enforced. This regulatory capture, where the regulated industry controls the regulators, created conditions where a ship that should have been prohibited from sailing continued operating year after year, carrying thousands of passengers, including school groups and families, who believed that passing government inspection meant the ship was safe. On April 16, 2014, the Sewol departed Incheon for Jeju Island, carrying 476 people, including 325 students from Danwon High School who were on a field trip, along with teachers and other passengers and crew. The ship was loaded far beyond legal limits with cargo that included vehicles and shipping containers and general freight, and the cargo was not properly secured because securing cargo takes time and reduces the amount that can be loaded, and the company prioritized maximizing cargo revenue over following procedures that would have ensured the cargo remained stable during the voyage. The ship left port top-heavy from the modifications that had added passenger decks, and from the overloading of cargo, and from ballast tanks that were improperly filled or maintained, creating a vessel that was unstable and that could capsize if anything caused the cargo to shift or if the ship turned sharply at speed. The voyage proceeded normally through the night and into the morning of April 16th, with students sleeping in cabins or gathering in common areas, excited about their field trip and completely unaware that they were aboard a ship that was one sharp turn away from capsizing. At approximately 8:48 a.m., as the ship was navigating a turn near Jindo Island, something caused the ship to list sharply to port, either the cargo shifting because it was not properly secured, or the turn being executed at excessive speed given the ship's overloaded and top-heavy condition, or both factors combining to overcome the ship's inadequate stability. The list increased rapidly from 15 degrees to 30 degrees to 45 degrees within seconds, and the ship could not recover because the cargo had shifted to the low side and because the ship's center of gravity was too high and because the ballast system could not compensate for the massive weight transfer. Captain Lee Jun-seok and the bridge crew immediately understood that the ship was capsizing, but instead of ordering immediate evacuation, the initial announcements over the ship's public address system told passengers to stay in their cabins and not to move. This order was repeated multiple times even as the list increased and even as it became obvious that the ship was not recovering, and the students, trained to obey authority and believing that crew members knew what they were doing, stayed in their cabins and waited for further instructions that never came. The reasons for this catastrophic order have been debated endlessly, whether the captain panicked and did not know what to do, whether he feared that passengers moving to muster stations would make the list worse, whether Korean cultural deference to authority made giving any order seem better than giving no order. But regardless of the reasons, the order to stay in place guaranteed maximum casualties because it kept passengers in the interior of the ship while the ship capsized around them. Captain Lee and most of the crew abandoned ship within 30 minutes of the list beginning, using the bridge emergency exit and lifeboats to escape, while passengers remained inside following the orders to stay in place. The captain was among the first people rescued, picked up by Coast Guard vessels while wearing civilian clothes rather than a uniform, initially claiming to be a passenger rather than admitting he was the captain who had abandoned his ship. The contrast between his escape and the fate of the students who obeyed his orders became the defining moral outrage of the disaster. The image of the captain in dry clothes being escorted to safety, while hundreds of teenagers drowned inside the ship he had commanded, became the symbol of the corruption and negligence that had enabled the disaster. Some crew members stayed and helped passengers evacuate, but many fled, and the confusion meant that many students never received orders to abandon ship and waited in cabins or corridors for rescue that would never come. The ship capsized completely by approximately 10:30 a.m., rolling onto its port side and then settling with the hull exposed and the superstructure underwater, and by that time most of the students were trapped inside, unable to reach exits that were now underwater or overhead, drowning in flooded compartments or in air pockets that slowly filled with water over the following hours. The Coast Guard response was slow and ineffective, hampered by confusion about the ship's exact location because the initial reports gave incorrect coordinates and by inadequate equipment for underwater rescue and by an organizational culture that was unprepared for disasters of this magnitude. Civilian divers, many of them commercial divers or volunteer divers, rushed to the scene and risked their lives diving into the wreck trying to find survivors. But the interior was a maze of flooded corridors and cabins, and the conditions made rescue extremely dangerous and mostly futile because by the time divers reached most of the trapped passengers, they were already dead. The final death toll was 304, including 250 students from Danwon High School who died because they followed orders to stay in their cabins, who trusted that adults knew what they were doing, who obeyed authority even when that obedience meant death. The bodies were recovered over weeks and months of diving operations that were agonizing for families who camped at Jindo Harbor waiting for their children to be brought up from the wreck. And some bodies were never recovered, remaining in the wreck when it was finally raised in 2017, 3 years after the sinking. The disaster became a national trauma that exposed the corruption and negligence that permeated Korean society, from the company that had overloaded the ship to the regulators who had accepted bribes to the Coast Guard that had failed to respond effectively to the captain who had abandoned children to die while he escaped. The trials that followed resulted in the captain being sentenced to life in prison for murder, not just for negligence or for abandoning ship, but for murder because ordering passengers to stay in place while he escaped was deemed legally equivalent to killing them. Other crew members received sentences ranging from 5 years to 30 years for abandoning passengers or for negligence. The company owner Yoo Byung-yoon went into hiding and was found dead months later under circumstances that remain unclear, possibly suicide, possibly murder. Regulatory officials were prosecuted for accepting bribes. The Coast Guard was disbanded and its functions transferred to other agencies. Prime Minister Chung Hong-won resigned. President Park Geun-hye's approval ratings collapsed, beginning the political crisis that would eventually lead to her impeachment in 2016. Though the impeachment was triggered by a separate corruption scandal, the Sewol disaster had destroyed public trust in her government's competence and honesty. The curse of the Sewol was the curse of systemic corruption, of an entire system, from ship owners to inspectors to Coast Guard, that prioritized profit and convenience over human life, and that failed catastrophically when tested. The ship was doomed from the moment it was modified to be top-heavy, from the moment inspectors accepted bribes to pass an unsafe vessel, from the moment the company decided that overloading was acceptable risk, from the moment the crew decided that their lives mattered more than passengers' lives. Every link in the chain failed simultaneously, and 304 people died as a result, most of them children who trusted that the adults responsible for their safety would keep them safe. The yellow ribbons that became the symbol of remembrance for the Sewol victims represent not just mourning but rage at a system that killed children through negligence and corruption and cowardice, and the disaster remains the most shameful moment in modern Korean history precisely because it was so preventable and because so many people had to fail or to be corrupt for it to happen. The Sewol proved that systemic corruption could turn an entire nation's regulatory apparatus into a mechanism for enabling mass death. But at least the disaster occurred in sight of land where rescue was theoretically possible, even if the response failed. And at least the world could see exactly what had happened and who was responsible. 1 year later, the El Faro demonstrated that ships could still disappear completely in the 21st century, despite satellite tracking, and despite communication systems that should make it impossible to lose contact, vanishing into a hurricane with all 43 crew members, and leaving only wreckage and recovered cargo containers and voice recorder transcripts to explain how a modern cargo ship with experienced officers and access to detailed weather forecasts could sail directly into the strongest hurricane to form in the Atlantic in nearly a decade. The El Faro represented the final evolution of the patterns we have traced through a century of disasters, combining engineering compromises with economic pressure, with corporate culture, with human decision-making failures into a catastrophe that killed an entire crew. The El Faro was built in 1975 as Puerto Rico, operating as a combination cargo and passenger ship before being converted to pure cargo operations in the 1990s. And by 2015, the ship was 40 years old and nearing the end of its economic life, maintained adequately to pass inspections, but not upgraded with the systems that newer ships possessed. The ship operated on the Jacksonville to San Juan route, carrying cargo between the continental United States and Puerto Rico, a service that was protected by maritime laws requiring that cargo between U.S. ports be carried on U.S.-flagged ships, crewed by American sailors, creating a captive market where competition was limited and where ships that would have been retired from international service could continue operating because the regulatory protection meant operators could charge rates that justified maintaining older vessels. This protectionism, intended to preserve American maritime jobs, had the unintended consequence of keeping aging ships in service longer than they would have survived in competitive international markets. Captain Michael Davidson commanded the El Faro on September 29, 2015, when the ship departed Jacksonville for San Juan carrying cargo containers and vehicles and general freight. And he was an experienced officer with decades at sea who knew the ship and the route, and who had sailed through storms before without serious problems. Weather forecasts showed that Hurricane Joaquin had formed and was intensifying in the Bahamas region, but the storm's projected track was uncertain, with forecast models disagreeing about whether the hurricane would turn north away from the shipping lane or continue west across the route that El Faro would take. Davidson and his officers discussed the weather during the departure planning, reviewing forecast data and considering route options, and they decided to proceed on the normal route because the forecast suggested they could pass north of the storm with sufficient margin for safety. But hurricane forecasting in 2015, despite decades of improvement, and despite satellite monitoring, and despite computer models, still contained substantial uncertainty, especially regarding track changes 2 or 3 days into the future. And Hurricane Joaquin did not follow the expected path, but instead stalled and intensified over the Bahamas, strengthening rapidly to Category 4 with winds exceeding 130 miles per hour. The storm system expanded as it intensified, creating dangerous conditions over a much larger area than early forecasts had predicted, and the area of extreme weather extended north along the path that El Faro was following. By October 1st, it should have been obvious that the ship was sailing into dangerous conditions, but Davidson appears to have believed that the ship could handle heavy weather and that turning back would mean missing the scheduled arrival in San Juan and facing questions from company management about why he had delayed the voyage. The economic pressure that influenced Davidson's decision-making was never explicitly stated in communications with the company, but the shipping industry operates on tight schedules where delays mean missed connections and unhappy customers, and where captains who consistently arrive late find themselves looking for new employment. The El Faro's operator, Maritime, maintained that captains had full authority to divert or delay voyages for safety reasons, and that no pressure was placed on Davidson to maintain schedule regardless of conditions, but the culture in commercial shipping is that on-time performance matters, and that captains are expected to manage weather risks through route optimization rather than through delays. Davidson had sailed through storms before by adjusting course to minimize exposure, and he apparently believed that he could do the same with Hurricane Joaquin. That experience and seamanship would allow him to thread between the worst of the storm and the scheduled arrival time. On the morning of October 1st, conditions deteriorated rapidly as the ship entered the outer bands of the hurricane, with wind speeds increasing and wave heights building, and the ship beginning to experience heavy rolling and pitching that made deck work dangerous, and that created stress on cargo and on the ship's structure. The bridge voice recorder captured conversations showing that Davidson and his officers were monitoring conditions and discussing options, but they continued toward San Juan rather than turning back or seeking shelter, apparently believing that the worst of the storm was still south of their position and that they would pass through the outer edges without encountering the extreme conditions near the eye. This assessment proved catastrophically wrong as the hurricane's track and expansion brought the core of the storm directly into the ship's path, subjecting the El Faro to conditions that the 40-year-old vessel was not designed to handle. At approximately 6 a.m. on October 1st, the ship experienced what crew members on the bridge described as a heavy list, possibly from cargo containers breaking loose and shifting, or from water entering through ventilation systems or cargo holds that were not sealed adequately against hurricane force conditions. The list was severe enough that the engineering crew reported that the ship's main propulsion had failed, leaving the vessel without power to maneuver and unable to maintain heading into the waves. And a ship without propulsion in hurricane conditions is doomed because the vessel will inevitably turn beam to the waves and will be rolled by the enormous forces that broadside wave impacts create. The captain ordered abandon ship around 7 a.m., but launching lifeboats in hurricane conditions with 40-foot waves and 130-mile-per-hour winds was virtually impossible. And even if lifeboats could be launched, survival time in such conditions would be measured in minutes. The last communication from the El Faro was received around 7:20 a.m. on October 1st, and after that time the ship disappeared completely, sinking so fast that crew members had no opportunity to deploy life rafts or to send additional distress signals, and the entire crew of 33 American citizens and 10 Polish nationals was lost. The search and rescue operation found only floating debris and empty life rafts and cargo containers, but no survivors and initially no bodies, and it took weeks before the wreck was located in nearly 15,000 feet of water northeast of the Bahamas, far deeper than the Titanic, and deep enough that recovery of the ship would be impossible. Remotely operated vehicles surveyed the wreck and recovered the voyage data recorder, the maritime equivalent of a black box, and the data and audio recordings provided the detailed timeline of the ship's final hours, but could not fully explain why Davidson had sailed into a hurricane that forecasts had clearly identified as dangerous. The investigation concluded that multiple factors contributed to the sinking, including the captain's decision to continue on the planned route despite deteriorating weather forecasts, the ship's age and condition, which made it vulnerable to flooding and propulsion failure, inadequate cargo securing that allowed containers to break loose and shift, and possibly structural failures in the hull or in ventilation systems that allowed water to flood critical spaces. But the investigation also identified the pressure that commercial ship captains face to maintain schedules and to minimize delays. Pressure that was never explicitly stated, but that existed within the economic structure of the shipping industry, where on-time performance affected company reputation, and where captains understood that consistent delays would harm their careers. Davidson was described by colleagues as a competent and safety-conscious officer who was not reckless, suggesting that his decision to proceed into the storm reflected not individual recklessness, but the normalization of risk-taking that commercial shipping encourages. The El Faro's crew included experienced sailors and engineers who had spent their careers at sea, who knew the risks of their profession and who trusted their captain's judgment and the ship's ability to handle heavy weather. They died because the combination of an aging ship with tight commercial schedules, with incomplete weather information with human optimism, created conditions where a decision that seemed reasonable at the time proved fatal when the hurricane intensified and expanded beyond what forecasts predicted. The voice recorder transcripts showed crew members maintaining professionalism even as conditions worsened, working to control flooding and to restore propulsion and to prepare lifeboats, performing their duties until the ship's final moments, even though they must have known that their chances of survival were vanishing. The curse of the El Faro was the curse of accumulated compromises, of small decisions to continue operating an aging ship, to maintain schedules despite marginal weather, to trust that experience would be sufficient to manage risks that technology and forecasting could identify but not eliminate. The ship did not sink because of a single catastrophic failure or because of obvious negligence, but because the entire system of commercial shipping creates incentives for captains to take risks and to push margins and to believe that they can manage dangers that in hindsight were unmanageable. Hurricane Joaquin was not unpredictable or unknown. The storm was tracked and forecasted, and warnings were issued, but the captain believed that the ship could handle the conditions and that maintaining schedule was worth the risk, and 43 people died because that belief was wrong. The El Faro vanished into the Atlantic, carrying 43 souls and taking with it the illusion that modern technology had finally conquered the sea. But the ship's disappearance was not really a mystery at all. It was simply the latest iteration of patterns that had repeated for more than a century, patterns that we have traced from Titanic's maiden voyage through Lusitania's war zone, to Empress of Ireland's fog, to Wilhelm Gustloff's refugee crisis, to Andrea Doria's radar complacency, to Herald of Free Enterprise's open doors, to Estonia's failed bow visor, to Costa Concordia's showboating captain, to Sewol's corruption, to El Faro's commercial pressure. Each disaster had unique circumstances and specific technical failures, but beneath the surface details, the fundamental causes remained constant across decades and across technological revolutions, revealing truths about human nature and corporate behavior and regulatory failure that technology cannot overcome because the problems are not fundamentally technical. The pattern begins with economics, with the reality that ships exist to make money and that every safety measure costs money, and that companies rationally calculate whether the cost of safety exceeds the expected cost of accidents multiplied by the probability of those accidents occurring. Titanic's insufficient lifeboats saved White Star Line money and weight and deck space. Lusitania's slower speed in submarine waters would have required extra days of operation and fuel for each crossing. The Herald of Free Enterprise's loading procedures that allowed sailing with bow doors open saved minutes in port, which translated to more crossings per year. Estonia continued operating with cracked visor mounts because comprehensive repairs would have required taking the ship out of service during profitable season. Costa Concordia's corporate culture encouraged sail-by salutes that created passenger excitement and social media buzz. Sewol's overloading multiplied cargo revenue on each crossing. El Faro's schedule pressure meant on-time arrival mattered more than optimal weather routing. In each case, economic incentives pushed toward accepting risks rather than eliminating them, and the disasters occurred when those risks materialized. The second element of the pattern is regulatory failure, the reality that government agencies tasked with enforcing safety standards are consistently outmatched by the industries they regulate, either through regulatory capture, where industries control their regulators, or through resource limitations, where agencies cannot afford the inspection and enforcement capabilities that effective regulation would require. The absence of lifeboat requirements that would have saved Titanic. The failure to close high-risk shipping routes during submarine warfare. The inadequate investigation of the collision that sank Empress of Ireland that let the responsible party escape consequences. The classification societies that certified Andrea Doria and Estonia as seaworthy without identifying critical vulnerabilities. The Port of Dover that allowed Herald of Free Enterprise to operate without enforcing door safety procedures. The Korean Maritime Safety Tribunal that accepted bribes to pass the unseaworthy Sewol. The Coast Guard inspections that certified 40-year-old El Faro despite aging systems. In each case, regulators either failed to establish adequate standards or failed to enforce the standards that existed, and the gap between regulation and reality created the space where disasters occurred. The third pattern is technological hubris, the recurring belief that each new generation of technology has finally solved the fundamental problems that doomed previous generations, that bigger ships are safer ships, that wireless communication eliminates isolation at sea, that radar prevents collisions, that GPS makes navigation errors impossible, that satellite weather forecasting removes uncertainty about storms. Titanic was unsinkable because of watertight compartments, until the iceberg proved that watertight compartments only work if the ship has enough of them, and they extend high enough. Lusitania was fast enough to outrun submarines until submarines proved capable of ambushing even fast ships. Andrea Doria had radar that should have prevented collisions until human misinterpretation of radar data proved that technology is only as good as the humans operating it. Costa Concordia had GPS showing exactly where the ship was, but could not show where underwater rocks were if those rocks were not on the charts. El Faro had satellite communication and weather data showing a hurricane, but the captain believed the ship could handle the storm. Each disaster taught the lesson that technology creates new capabilities, but also creates new ways to fail and new forms of overconfidence. The fourth element is human psychology, specifically the optimism bias and normalization of deviance that causes individuals and organizations to underestimate risks that they have successfully navigated before. Titanic's Captain Smith had sailed for decades without serious incident and believed his experience meant he could safely navigate ice fields at high speed. Wilhelm Gustloff's officers loaded 10,000 refugees because previous evacuation voyages had succeeded despite overcrowding. Herald of Free Enterprise captains had sailed with bow doors partially open before without sinking, and the practice became normalized. Costa Concordia's Scatino had performed close approach salutes before, without grounding. Sewol's operators had overloaded the ship for years without capsizing. El Faro's Davidson had sailed through storms before and believed he could manage Hurricane Joaquin. In each case, previous success created confidence that risks were manageable, and that confidence persisted until catastrophic failure proved that the risks had always been real even when they had not yet materialized. The fifth pattern is the moment of crisis, the minutes or hours when disaster becomes inevitable, but when different decisions might still save lives, and when human failures of leadership and communication and courage determine how many people die. Titanic's lifeboats launched half-empty because no one took charge of evacuation procedures. Lusitania sank so fast that organized evacuation was impossible but the speed would have been less catastrophic if damage control had been more effective. Empress of Ireland's collision in fog could not have been prevented once both ships committed to fatal courses, but better communication might have clarified intentions. Wilhelm Gustloff had no chance once the torpedoes struck, but the extreme overcrowding guaranteed maximum casualties. Andrea Doria's evacuation succeeded because the captain maintained control and because neighboring ships arrived quickly. Herald of Free Enterprise capsized so fast that evacuation was barely possible. Estonia sank in darkness with inadequate time for organized rescue. Costa Concordia's captain delayed evacuation and then abandoned ship while passengers remained aboard. Sewol's crew ordered students to stay in place and then fled. El Faro's crew had no chance once propulsion failed in hurricane conditions. Each crisis revealed whether leadership would rise to the occasion or collapse under pressure, and casualties depended as much on human courage and competence as on the technical circumstances of the disaster. The common thread connecting all these patterns is that ships sink when multiple failures occur simultaneously, when the Swiss cheese model of accident causation aligns perfectly so that holes in every defensive layer line up and allow disaster to pass through unchecked. Titanic needed high speed and ice field and dark moonless night and binocular shortage and lookout distraction and watertight compartment design flaw all to occur together. Estonia needed design weakness and maintenance, neglect, and storm conditions, and failed locks all to occur together. Sewol needed corruption and overloading, and sharp turn and cargo shift, and captain abandonment, and regulatory failure all to occur together. Single failures are manageable because redundancy and safety margins and human adaptability can compensate. But when everything fails at once, when all the defenses collapse simultaneously, ships sink and people die, and investigations afterward identify the perfect storm of circumstances that should never have been allowed to occur, but that somehow occurred anyway. The fundamental question that emerges from examining a century of maritime disasters is whether these patterns can ever be broken or whether they are inherent features of human nature and economic systems and technological complexity that will continue producing disasters regardless of how many lessons we claim to have learned. The optimistic interpretation is that each disaster does produce incremental improvements, that Titanic led to better lifeboats and ice patrol and radio regulations, that later disasters led to better design standards and better training and better regulatory oversight, and that the trend over time is toward safer ships and fewer casualties, even if progress is slower than we would like, and even if disasters still occur. The pessimistic interpretation is that economic pressure and human psychology and technological hubris are constants that will always generate new forms of risk faster than regulation and learning can eliminate them, and that we are trapped in an endless cycle where each generation believes it has solved problems that prove unsolvable. The truth is probably somewhere between optimism and pessimism, that ships are genuinely safer than they were a century ago, that maritime disasters kill fewer people per ship mile traveled than in previous eras, that technology and regulation and experience have created real improvements in safety outcomes, but also that the fundamental dynamics that cause disasters have not changed and will continue producing catastrophes whenever circumstances align correctly. The ships get bigger and faster and more sophisticated, but they still sink when hubris overcomes caution, when profit pressures overcome safety spending, when regulatory failure creates gaps between requirements and reality, when human psychology normalizes risks until those risks materialize, when leaders fail during crisis moments. The sea remains unforgiving of human errors and mechanical failures, and the cost of those errors remains measured in lives lost. Perhaps the real lesson is not that we can eliminate maritime disasters, but that we must remain permanently vigilant, that each generation must relearn the lessons that previous generations learned at such terrible cost, that technology creates new capabilities, but also new vulnerabilities, that economic incentives will always push toward risk acceptance unless regulation actively prevents it, that human psychology will always seek optimistic interpretations until reality proves otherwise. The ships that sank were not fundamentally different from ships that did not sink. They were simply unlucky enough, or poorly commanded enough, or badly maintained enough, that when circumstances aligned against them, they had no margins left and no defenses remaining. Every ship that sails carries within it the possibility of becoming the next Titanic, or Estonia, or Sewol, and preventing that outcome requires not just technology and regulation, but eternal awareness that the sea kills those who forget to fear it, and that the patterns that doomed ships across a century of disasters remain active today, waiting for the next perfect alignment of failures that will send another ship to the bottom and teach us once again that some lessons cannot be learned permanently, only relearned at the cost of lives that should never have been lost.